Hello and welcome. My name is Gallo Calderon. I am the production manager of DATAVERSITY. We would like to thank you for joining the current installment of the monthly DATAVERSITY webinar series, Real World Data Governance with Bob Seiner. Today, Bob will discuss the future of data stewardship, trends, and innovation. Just a couple of points before we get started. Due to the large number of people that attended these sessions, you will be muted during the webinar. If you would like to chat with us or with each other, we certainly encourage you to do so. And to note, Zoom defaults the chat to send to just panelists, but you may also switch that to chat with each other and with everyone. For questions, we will be collecting them via the Q&A section. To find the chat and the Q&A panels, you may click those icons in the bottom middle of your screen in the Zoom toolbar to activate those features. And as always, we will send a follow-up email within 2 business days containing links to the slides, the recordings of the session, and additional information requested throughout the webinar. Now, let me introduce you to our speaker for the series, Bob Seiner. Bob is the president of Principal Kick Consulting and Educational Services and the publisher emeritus of the Data Administration newsletter. Bob specializes in non-invasive data governance, data stewardship, and metadata management solutions. So now I will hand things over to Bob for this presentation. Hello and welcome. How are you doing today, Bob?
Thank you, Gallo. Gallo, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Just want to make sure that people can hear me because, getting halfway through the webinar and not being heard, that could be a problem. So I
Just
wanted
a
to,
little bit.
wanted to welcome you, Gallo, to the Real World Data Governance family. We've been doing these webinars on Dataversity for some time, and I've only had a couple of different people produce over the time, Shannon and Mark, and it's great to have you here. So looking forward to working with you on this. So thank you very much. I wanted to wish everybody, I think today's a good day to celebrate. Wish you happy Juneteenth. I also wanted to wish you happy summer. If you're here in the US, the first day of summer starts tomorrow, although today in Pittsburgh and the next couple of days in Pittsburgh, it's going to be in the 90s. So it's going to be really, we're going to hit summer in full stride on the first day of summer. We got a great topic today. I always joke with Shannon, I always joke with Mark about how the topics that we plan, almost a year in advance or at least 6 months in advance, all seem to be really relevant when we get to talking about them. And I know that with a lot of my clients and a lot of the organizations I've been working with, data stewardship is something that's top of mind to a lot of people. And as you probably know, with the changes in the data environments and AI and everything that's happening in the industry, a lot is changing in the data industry in general. A lot is actually happening in the or changing in the data governance space as well. You may be familiar with DAMA, and the DMBOK 3 is right around the corner of being introduced. Another thing that's changing is that I've been focusing a lot on kind of changing the way people talk about data governance. People talk about how data governance is failing, and I'm saying, no, data governance isn't really failing. It's the way that people are talking about it is failing. And I think the same thing holds true to data stewards as well. And so I hope by the end of this session, you'll consider some things that are changing in the world of data stewardship. What are some of the trends? What are some of the innovations and things that we can take advantage of, and the things that we can do as we move forward? Oops, I'm going backwards here. Let's go forward. And I always start my webinars by sharing a little bit with you about me and my background. If you're not familiar with it, we've been doing this real world data governance webinar series on Dataversity since January of 2012. So this, as I mentioned earlier, this is the 161st episode of the Real World Data Governance series. Next month, we have a really interesting topic because it's kind of off the beaten path, should I say, of data governance and data stewardship. And we're going to talk about aligning data governance with corporate social responsibility. And if you don't know what corporate social responsibility is, or it's not something that your company is talking about now, at some point they will be talking about it. And it's, how do we align governance with the way organizations are contributing to societal goals and community development and those types of things. So it'll be an interesting subject. Um, for sure, as we talk about how we're going to align data governance with this CSR, with the corporate social responsibility. I talk a lot about non-invasive data governance. I have published several books on non-invasive data governance. The first one came out in 2014. It's been translated into a bunch of languages. The second book was Non-Invasive Data Governance Strikes Again, and it had to have struck once in order for it to strike again, and that was well accepted in 2023. But the biggest news is really in the last couple of months, where we released the third non-invasive data governance book, and it's really focused on the topic, on a lot of the things surrounding the topic that we're going to discuss today. It's all about empowering people to govern data and AI. Just a couple more things. I have several learning plans that are available through DATAVERSITY, one on, surprisingly, non-invasive data governance, one on non-invasive metadata governance, and then the most recent one was on business glossaries, data dictionaries, and data catalogs. The name of my consulting business is KIK Consulting and Educational Services. KIK stands for Knowledge is King. And I basically refer to the website as being the home of non-invasive data governance. As I often joke, or, in my spare time, I'm an adjunct faculty member at Carnegie Mellon University here in my hometown of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in their Chief Data and AI Officer Certificate Program. So we got a busy life going on here, but we got a great topic for you today. And like I said, I want to talk to you about where data stewardship is going. What are some of the trends that I've been seeing? What are some of the innovations that can perhaps be taken care of, taken advantage of by organizations? So I'm going to talk first. I basically, in the order, I'm going to talk about trends. I'm going to talk about tools, innovative tools these days that haven't been around forever that you might be able to or might consider using to empower your data stewards. Then we'll talk about how some of the trends and innovations, things are changing in the best practices around this thing called modern data stewardship. You hear the term modern being used all the time, modern organizations, modern CDOs. Well, there's also a focus on modern data stewardship as well. How has data stewardship evolved and how will it continue to evolve as the data landscapes and the information landscapes in our organizations continue to evolve? Then I'm going to talk about aligning stewardship with things that will be happening in the future. We'll kind of pull out our crystal ball and look into the future and see if we can find ways to align stewardship with what's happening and what's going to happen in the future. And then, as I like to do during these webinars, I'll spend the last couple of minutes just walking through a handful of case studies of organizations that I've worked with that have taken data stewardship to heart, and they've really kind of spun it in the way that worked best in their organization. So I'm looking forward to sharing that with you at the end of the webinar. So with all the webinars, I always start with some simple definitions. And I think we all need to get on the same page in terms of the definitions, or at least have a common understanding of them. And I always share these three definitions that you see on the screen now: data governance, stewardship, and what it means to be a data steward. I just want to go through them real quickly with you. I word my definition of data governance very strongly. I talk about it as being the execution and enforcement of authority over the data. And people say, hey, Bob, you're talking about us being non-invasive, but then you're using terms like executing and enforcing authority. Well, the truth is that any approach that you take to governance, at the end of the day, the idea is that you want to be able to execute and enforce authority over that data. And non-invasive is really just the approach versus the command and control, or the traditional, I refer to it as the field of dreams approach of, if you build it, people will gravitate to it. So if you build it, they will come. So governance needs to be worded strongly. That's my definition, and I've been using it for many years. The more relevant definition is for data stewardship, and I refer to data stewardship as the formal accountability for data. If you've attended these webinars in the past, I've talked about how the fact that potentially everybody in the organization that has a relationship to the data, meaning they define the data, they produce the data, they use the data. If they are being held formally accountable for how they define, produce, and use data, they're basically a steward. And if you look up steward in the dictionary, what it says is that a steward is somebody who takes care of something for somebody else. And that's basically what the stewards of the organization do. They take care of the data for the organization. So I say everybody is a data steward. Basically, everybody has a relationship to the data as a definer, a producer, or a user of of the data. So therefore, potentially, everybody in the organization is a data steward. I write a lot on data governance topics, on data stewardship topics. I wrote an article that I published on tdan.com back in 2016 that was called Seiner's Data Steward Rules. The term Seiner's Data Steward Rules haven't caught on, but I still stand behind these rules and I reiterate them to the organizations that I work with. I just want to walk through them quickly with you, that a data steward can be basically anybody in your organization. Like I said, if they define data or if they produce data or they use data as part of their job and they're being held accountable for those actions, anybody in the organization can be a steward. And basically, being a steward describes a relationship to the data, and it's not typically a position. I say that organizations that are hiring people to be data stewards might want to reconsider. They might want to consider that you've already got people in the organization who are stewarding data, and people in the organization don't have to have the title of being a data steward. I also say stewards don't need to be told how to do their jobs, his or her jobs, because they're good, or at least they've been hired to do a specific job. Stewarding the data aspect of their job is just, like I said, an aspect of their job. And I also don't think it makes sense to send people out for data steward certification because, again, people don't need to be told how to do their jobs. They need to be told what it means to be a steward and what it means to have relationships to the data that you're being held accountable for. But I think that stewardship training should be more focused on kind of formalizing people's accountability for what they're doing. And the last thing here is that there's more than one steward for each type of data within the organization. And I'll talk to you about that a little bit more. There's obviously more than one person using the data or defining certain data or producing data. And if they're all being held accountable for that relationship to the data, then they are actually the people who are stewarding or taking care of the data for the organization. I've started to throw in, kind of as a introduction to the webinars, this before we get started section. So I just want to go through them quickly and then jump into the key points that I want to make in today's webinar. So as I mentioned, data stewardship is evolving rapidly as organizations are evolving rapidly due to technological changes, due to where the data is being stored, the need for real-time analytics. So we just got to keep in mind that stewardship is evolving just as organizations are evolving, just as technology is evolving, and we've got to be able to keep up with the change and evolve stewardship as well. The stewards of the organization, potentially, again, everybody in the organization that's being held accountable for their relationship to the data, they're central to the organization getting to the point where they trust the data. And the modern data stewards, and then again, these are not the one person that we used to define to be our customer data steward for our multinational company that sells in every state in every country. No, you're not going to just have one steward per type of data. You're going to have a lot of stewards, and the modern stewards could basically be anybody within the organization and not just those few that you're going to pull out or you're going to select and say, hey, we're going to appoint you to be a data steward or we're going to assign you to be a data steward. Those are really non-starters in the non-invasive data governance world. And data governance really depends on the success of the stewards within the organization. A friend of mine said, Len Silverstein, who's spoken a lot at DATAVERSITY events, said, we shouldn't even call it data governance. We should be calling it people governance because it's people's behavior that need to be governed effectively within the organization. So again, governance depends on the stewards of the organization. A couple other points here, just before we get started into the subjects of today, is that being innovative in the way we're thinking about our stewards. And I'll share with you some examples of organizations that have kind of taken stewardship and made them their own. But being innovative in the way that we're utilizing stewards in the organization, it really is necessary in order to kind of keep up with the changing times. And we want to make certain that however we're approaching stewardship, that we're being as practical and pragmatic as we can. And it's not just about people, or it's all really about people. It's not all about policies. And I know there's a lot of governance programs that start out by defining policies and saying, okay, well, just because we write the policies, now everybody's going to start to follow them. That's not typically the way it works. You're probably nodding your head up and down right now because, as you've seen in your organization, that's typically not the way it works. All right, so here, out of the five topics that I said I was going to talk about, the trends, the tools, the best practices, the aligning it with business need, and then the case studies. The first topic was the emerging trends in data stewardship. And I want to walk through a couple of those trends with you. As I've always said, AI is not going to replace you. I know there were some things published on LinkedIn even yesterday about how AI is going to replace you. And I kind of take a different angle with that. And I say people who know how to use AI might replace you, but AI itself is not going to replace you. So, as stewards, as people that are implementing stewardship, we need to help to augment the activities of the stewards using the tools that are available to us now. And I'll talk a little bit about those as well in the webinar today. I want to talk about stewardship without borders. I want to talk about how we're really these modern data stewards, as I refer to them. We're really moving from being the gatekeepers to being the guides to the data within your organization. In fact, the stewards are often looked up to as the ones that should be exemplifying good data related behaviors and how they're defining, producing, and using data. So we'll talk briefly about how we're moving stewards from being gatekeepers to more guides and more advocates for good data management within the organization, real-time stewards for real-time data, and then we'll talk about non-invasive data governance and how do we scale that across the organization. So the first subject that I want to talk to you about in terms of emerging trends, the first trend is there's a rise in something that I'm seeing is calling AI augmented stewardship. And it's like what tools can we provide to our stewards that are going to help them to be more efficient and therefore more effective in their role as a data steward? So the AI tools that are available today can do a lot of different things. Do they can automate typical activities like data classification, anything that you can even to write business descriptions or glossary descriptions for your organization. um, these tools that will help the stewards to do these things. Generative AI is a very powerful tool. What we're looking to do is free up the stewards to do things that are more strategic and contextual in nature within the organization. um, Predictive insights. AI can certainly help stewards to identify where there's problems before the problems start to exist. For example, they can recognize if data is now consistently leaning towards falling out of typical ranges, or that data is missing more often than other times, or more often than in the past. There's ways to be able to use AI to review the data to give you some predictive insights that even before they start to negatively impact your business operations. And a lot of these tools, the capabilities around natural language interfaces, being able to chat with chatbots and asking questions, that is the wave of the future. We want to consider how can we take these tools and how can we make them relevant and help to augment the activities of the data stewards. Another thing I want to talk about, another one of these emerging trends is that the data is being spread all over the organization. And in fact, if you're not familiar with federated governance or federated stewardship, in a centralized stewardship or governance environment, there might be one group that has the authority to be able to make the rules and expect the stewards to follow the rules. In a federated environment, typically the one group or the data governance office or the data governance administration group can set the rules, can provide minimal standards for the stewards out in different parts of the organization to follow, to use them as guidelines, to again follow these as minimal standards. So what we need to do is we need to kind of break down the walls between the different parts of the organization, and we want to basically have stewardship be applied consistently across the organization. That means across business units, across regions, across platforms, even across systems in the organization. And another way to be able to break down these borders is to be able to provide them the tools that allows them to collaborate with each other. And in the next section, when I get out of trends and I get into tools, we'll talk about some of those tools that might be available to you in your organization that helps to ensure that the stewards, who could again be more than just the handful that you're selecting, that they have means to be able to collaborate with each other. And then this hybrid environments where where data is in different platforms, in different locations, and some of it is in the cloud and some of it is on prem. We need to be flexible as our organizations change, as our data landscape changes. We need to make certain that our data stewards are keeping up with the times, that we don't just start with a data stewardship program one way and expect that it's going to consistently be that way forever. We need to keep up with the changing times within our organizations. I love this guy who comes flying across the middle of the screen. He looks like he has an attitude. Well, we're going to be moving the stewards from being the gatekeepers to the data. People think of data governance and data stewardship as being kind of overhead for the organization. We want to get that to change. We want the data stewards within the organization to, again, exemplify data related behavior, to not only become I refer to them as super stewards, as not just people who are stewards because they've been recognized as stewards, but stewards who embrace the concepts of data governance. So they can act as educators. They can build data literacy across the organization. Again, the data stewards playing more than just the role of being accountable for defining, producing, and using data. They can be the champions. They can be the ones selling data literacy across the organization. When I talk about data literacy, I'm talking about being able to tell stories with data, tell stories about data. And that's what, data stewards, if we can help to educate them and to train them, they are great voices for the data governance program throughout the organization. So the role of the stewards themselves is changing from being more of an enforcement to more of an enablement role. Where the stewards, if they're taking the role of stewardship seriously, they can really help project teams, help functional teams to use data more confidently and more responsibly. So again, then we're moving stewards. One of the trends is the stewards are not just the gatekeepers anymore. They might be gatekeepers if they need to be, but they're really becoming the guides. They're really becoming those people that are sharing what positive data behavior looks like, and if they can get other people in the organization to recognize themselves as data stewards and start feeling and acting the same way, it's going to be a good thing for your organization. We need to take advantage of all these people that we're recognizing for their relationship to the data, who are the stewards of the data, and help to enable them to really enable success with governance throughout the organization. There's changes in the need for real-time data. We've got to adapt to the changes, like I said before, that are taking place within the organization. When it says here, meeting the demands of streaming and edge, and by edge, I mean edge computing. And if you're not familiar with edge computing, go look it up. It's where the process where we're looking to move a lot of the processing more closely to the source. And now there's things called edge AI even, which is moving AI down to local devices instead of having like an enterprise device. So there's edge computing, there's edge AI. maybe there's such a thing as edge governance as well. I talk about how we push the need for accountability out to the masses, out to the people who are defining and producing data. I think it sounds like a good up and coming article on edge governance in the same vein as edge computing and edge AI. So stewards need to adapt to data flows that are changing within the organization. Um, I always talk about how we really need to just apply governance to process rather than redefine our processes. So if your data flows are changing and they change with real time, as activities or as operations are taking place in your organization, we must be able to adapt our processes and apply governance in a consistent way to the new and evolving processes within the organization. Certainly, streaming data and the volume of data and the continuous validation, that as well is going to have an impact on stewards. Because again, we're not just talking about data that we're importing from a source, we're talking about data that is constantly being updated, constantly coming into the organization. And the stewards need to be able to react at the speed of operations in terms of that streaming data that's coming into the organization. And the last trend that I'm seeing is that there's a lot of organizations that are starting by taking this non-invasive approach to governance, which means that instead of assigning people or appointing people to be data stewards, they're taking more of a recognition approach. And they're saying, okay, we recognize that you're using sensitive data, so we're going to make certain that you know the rules and that you're being held accountable for how you're using the data to follow those rules. So instead of trying to assign people new roles and get people to become scared or threatened by data governance, these organizations that are recognizing the stewards instead of assigning or appointing them, they're finding that we need to do this not only in the couple places that we've started with governance and stewardship, but in across the entire organization. And again, if you're taking a federated approach and you're pushing some of the governance of the data out to the different business functions, we need the stewards of the organization to be trained and to be educated on what it means to be accountable and the steps that they need to take or the potentially minor changes that would take place in their job in order for them to govern and to steward the data better. I see a bunch of people raising hands. If you would rather, please enter your questions into the Q&A section, and then Gallo will help us to kind of moderate through the questions when we get to the end of the webinar. All right, so I talked about the first trends, and there are a lot of trends in stewardship, and you may be seeing different ones in your organization. And if you want to, use the chat area to talk about trends of things that are changing within your organization. Now I want to talk about the tools and what can we do with the existing tools in our organization to empower data stewards to be more effective within the organization. And I'm quickly going to go through a couple different types of tools like smart catalog tools that have stewardship workflows built into them. I can't tell you how important that is. And if you're out there evaluating data catalog tools, that's one of the things that kind of differentiates some vendors and their products from other vendors is that how well they have stewardship workflows built into their tools. So the catalogs can help to empower the data stewards that way. There's also tools that they can use, AI powered tools that will help them to build out the business glossaries and the data dictionaries. There's collaborative stewardship platforms I mentioned earlier. I'll talk a little bit more about them. What are some of those platforms that we can use? What do automated stewardship scorecards look like? Again, these are all innovative tools that we can use to empower stewards. And then, really, the core thought behind non invasive data governance is that we're going to embed stewardship into the everyday processes and embed them into everyday tools instead of making it feel like it's something that's over and above what they're presently doing. Let's build it, let's embed it into the things people are presently doing. So let's start with the smart catalogs. And like I said, if you are in the process of evaluating data catalog tools, most of them have somewhat similar functionality in that they can capture the metadata, they can share the metadata, But from a stewardship perspective, you may want to be asking questions about, well, what automated workflows do you have built into your tool? Can you share with us how they work? Can you share with us examples of how organizations have benefited from these workflows to actually engage the stewards? Because in a lot of organizations that I have spoken to, recently and in the past, they've they've gone out and they've identified who the stewards are. They've assigned people to be data stewards, but they're not getting a whole lot out of these folks beyond that. So, if you have the workflows in your data catalog tool, not only does that direct the stewards into the tool itself, but it also then helps them to understand the workflows. Where does the data need to be governed along the way? And then there's AI powered glossary and definition tools where AI can be used to suggest terms or to suggest relationships between different pieces of data, to rationalize the data. Say, we call it this in this system. Can you help me to find out what other systems this data resides in? Using the business definitions, using the names of the fields. So the glossaries and the definition and the dictionaries in the past, they're now evolving as well, and they're starting to become more AI powered. And if we can educate and train our stewards on how to use those tools, it's going to help them to become better stewards. It's going to help our governance program to gain traction more easier within the organization. Um, and so, make sure that you're educating your stewards, you're empowering your stewards with the tools that you have available to you. There's collaborative stewardship platforms. I know I'm going to fall behind here if I don't speed up here a little bit, but there's platforms like Teams. There's platforms like SharePoint and other platforms internally within organizations, OneNote and things like that, that can be used to get stewards cross function to be able to coordinate and collaborate together. So take advantage of the tools that you have within your organization that are used to bring people together for data stewardship. Build communities of or centers of excellence or communities of practice, but give them the means to be able to communicate effectively with each other. Chat style interfaces, role aware dashboards. What I mean by role aware dashboards is dashboards that know who the user is, who's coming in to look at the dashboard, and it caters the information that's being provided to that steward, basically per what their specific job is within the organization. So there's the collaborative stewardship platforms. There's also um, there's also automated stewardship scorecards, or you can automate your stewardship scorecards. And one of the most important things when you're talking about evaluating your stewards is identifying what are the appropriate metrics that we would use, that we would need to have the data to support, that we could automate and provide to the stewards. Things like, how well are they contributing to the metadata? Um, how is the amount of time it's taking to resolve issues being reduced? How well are stewards participating? What percentage of the critical data elements have now been certified in the organization? Those are all things that you can keep track of data on and basically provide automated scorecards to the stewards and to the management to show how your stewardship program is working within your organization. And this is really important. This is really the last tool that I want to talk about is or the last thing I want to talk about in terms of tools. And we really want to embed stewardship into the use of the tools. Many years ago, I'm probably going to date myself here a little bit, is there was a tool called Business Objects. Business Objects was a reporting tool. Business Objects was acquired, I think, in 2006 or 2007 by SAP. The cool thing about Business Objects is that it had a repository of metadata behind it. So you could hover over a specific column or a specific table and you could get a description of what that field is, or you might get a box that has different tags on it or labels on it that you could see what was the lineage, where did this data come from, what other data like this data exists that we could use in reporting. So build stewardship into the tools that you're using. And I know that a lot of the catalog tools provide the ability to be able to share metadata with other tools or through other tools. If it doesn't have that functionality, again, maybe that's something that you should be asking for in terms of your the data catalogs. All right, so I know I'm going through these quickly. We talked about the trends, we talked about the tools. Let's talk quickly about what some of the best practices are that are changing, basically for these modern stewards. And again, I refer to modern stewards as potentially being everybody in the organization rather than that one person that is the customer data steward. Oh, we have a question about customer. We're going to go to Bob. Well, Bob is in the US and Mary is in the UK, and they do things different in the UK. We need to make certain that we understand that there's more than one type of steward or one steward per type of data within the organization. So some of these best practices are that stewards are being recognized based on the role, based on the actions that they're taking with data. We need to focus stewardship more at the point of where they are actually working, where meet the stewards where they are. Focus stewardship on the point of data use, enabling stewards through targeted training and tools. I talked about that a little bit before. And then aligning stewardship with business priorities. That seems to be a number one priority. You don't want your stewards active doing things, or you don't want to ask your stewards to get actively involved in doing something that doesn't pertain or doesn't link to some of the business priorities. You don't want the question of why are you doing that? When you really, well, you want to have an answer, say, because that's what our business is prioritizing. Those are the things that are most important to the organization at this time. And another practice that is evolving is how people are going about promoting the wins that the stewardships are representing within the organization. So again, it's kind of funny here when I put this together. I put stewardship happens. It almost sounds like stuff happens. Well, stewardship basically does happen wherever people are defining, producing, and using data, and that doesn't matter what their job title is. If they're using data that is sensitive, they need to expect that they need to formally be accountable for how they're using that data. Boy, we can improve the definition of the data uh, uh, tremendously by getting people who know the data to help us to put good business definition to the data. Same thing holds true for the people who produce the data. Again, we don't need to call them all stewards. They already have titles, they already have jobs, but part of their responsibility is to steward the data that they're defining, producing, and using. So focusing on the accountability by role, not rule, and not creating new job descriptions, because new job descriptions are bottlenecks. They certainly feel invasive. They certainly feel like they're there to obstruct rather than enable or as a catalyst to making data governance become more effective in the organization. And I mentioned before, focus stewardship where the stewards live, where they are working. Embed stewardship into the tools where they're accessing the data, where they're analyzing the data, where they're sharing the data. Certainly, wouldn't it be good if people are asking to share data across the organization, that they know what the rules are as to who they can share data with and who they can't share data with? You want people to follow the rules. Well, the stewards are then expected to follow the rules. But in order for them to do that, they need to know and understand the rules. So focus on stewardship where the stewards are stewarding. I know that kind of sounds silly a little bit, but if the stewards are people who define, produce, and use data, who are being held formally accountable for those actions, let's find out where they're defining data. Where are they producing the data? Where are they using the data? And apply stewardship basically right at the point of these data actions that they're taking. Targeted training and tools. What's interesting is just because you go and you recognize somebody as a steward, or you appoint them or you assign them to be a steward, which I try not to do, you can't just turn to them and say, okay, you're now a steward, go and start doing data steward stuff. They're not going to know what that data steward stuff is. So we need to educate them. We need to train them on what it means to be a steward, for them to understand why they've been recognized as being a steward and what tools are available to them to help them to make their job more efficient and more effective. So we need to deliver this training to the stewards specific to the type of role that they have. Now, in previous webinars, I've talked about different levels of data stewards within the organization. There's more operational stewards who define, produce, and use data as part of their job. And then there's more tactical stewards who are kind of the subject matter experts for the data across business functions. You're not going to educate the operational stewards the same way that you're going to educate the tactical or the data domain stewards within the organization. So make certain that you're targeting the training and the tools specifically to the groups and the audiences that you are expecting to become stewards. Another thing that I've heard from organizations is that they 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 start to use these data catalog tools that have 50 different functions that they all do well, and they roll them all out to these folks all at one time. I would suggest do it more incrementally. Give them the most important functionality first, learn from them how they're using it, if there's ways they could better use it, and then add to the training. Again, don't overwhelm the stewards, but provide them with just in time training targeted specifically at the things that they're doing within the organization. And I would say that as far as a best practice is concerned, this is probably, I don't consider it to be the number one best practice, but if we are not aligning the things that our stewards are doing with the priorities of the organization, we're making a mistake, or organizations that are doing that are making mistakes. So we need to link the stewardship to things that can be measured within the organization. The business goals support the activities like AI, AI development, AI model development, compliance, decision making. We need to align stewards. Again, you don't want the stewards to be asked, why are you doing that? That doesn't align with anything that is important to the organization right now. We don't need definitions for all 150 data elements in a specific database or a system. We really need to focus on those things that are business priorities, those critical data elements to the organization. And really the last best practice I want to talk about is, the need for us to promote the successful things that data stewards are doing, the wins that they're coming across as they steward data as part of their regular jobs. So we want to celebrate the quick wins by highlighting how the stewards have had impact on things like quality, trust, access to the data. Use storytelling, help to get your stewards to become more data literate. As I said before, data literacy to me is being able to not only tell stories with the data, but to be able to tell stories about the data. We're having issues, this data is not being created the way it needs to be created. We need to be able to talk not only about how the data is successful, helps us to be successful in our business, we also need to tell stories about how the data and the data quality and the data access might be lacking in our organization and how we need to move that forward. So if there's nobody who has the responsibility of promoting the stewardship wins, they're not going to get promoted. You already have tools available to your organization, newsletters, town halls, other things that your organization uses. Um, Leverage those tools. Especially if they're valuable to the organization and people are used to reading these tools or attending these town halls, get a chance to speak for 5 minutes about how important stewardship is and how potentially everybody in the organization is a steward of the data and what that means to the organization. So again, promote stewardship wins across the organization. All right, the last subject that I'm going to go through quickly and then kind of fly through some case studies at the end is something that's really important, something that we need to consider as our environment changes, as our data environment changes, as our technology changes. How do we align stewardship with things that are going to be taking place in the future? Now, I don't have a crystal ball to be able to tell the future, but I can tell you right now that AI is not going away. Quantum computing is probably next in the path of major things that are going to impact organizations. We need to position stewards as being those frontline enablers of AI. They're no longer just the stewards who are going around finding, producing, and using data. They're the ones that are exemplifying better data behavior across the organization. So we need to position our stewards as such. We need to integrate them across, and we could do we could do a complete webinar on structured data and unstructured data. So I'm going to touch on that here for in a minute. We need to adapt the steward roles to the way that our ecosystems around data are evolving. I've talked about that quite a bit. Connect stewardship to measurable business outcomes. Let's kind of jump into aligning stewardship with future needs. So one thing is we need to position our stewards. We don't, first of all, don't want them to look as being a steward as being a chore. It's basically part of their responsibility. They're recognized, it has a positive connotation. They're recognized for what they do. They're recognized because they use data that's very sensitive, then they need to know the rules associated with it. We also need to empower our stewards to be able to talk more about how important governance is and how important stewardship is to the organization. Get them to be able to explain to people the connection between data and AI. So we need to position our stewards, basically make them the champions of data across the organization. Maybe not all your stewards are going to want to be the champions of the data, but I'll tell you this, if they find positive impacts from the things that they're doing, they are going to become champions. And if we can get them to share the word and basically be the talking voices across the organization as to how we can be successful with governance and stewardship, we should be considering positioning these people as enablers. Actually, I stopped using the word enable and started to use data governance as a catalyst. It's kind of that spark to get things moving within the organization. If we can get the stewards of the organization to be that spark, again, that's going to be a gain for the organization. And stewards are not only just stewards of the structured data, the databases and the columns and the tables within the systems in the organization. In this day and age, AI doesn't really care where it gets its data from. It's going to get it from structured data. It's going to get it from unstructured data, semi-structured data. So this whole industry of information governance, which kind of is out there alongside data governance, it really is data governance for the unstructured or the semi-structured data. So we need to start aligning stewardship with not only just the governance of the structured data within the organization, we need to also have stewards for things that are unstructured, such as emails and documents and those types of things that aren't in bits and bytes and tables and rows within the organization. So if you're not doing that, I'm telling you, there's a big convergence coming between unstructured data governance and structured data governance, which again is information governance and data governance. So keep an eye out for that, because if you're not yet talking information governance, records management, content management as a form of data governance, you will be soon. Adapt the steward roles to your evolving data ecosystem. Again, data is being stored in different places. There's now real-time data. There's new pipelines of data. There's streaming data. We need to evolve our stewards roles to take care of the different types of data and different ways that data are coming into our organization. And we need to connect stewardship again to the measurable business outcomes. I had this conversation with a client the other day where they kept talking about all the great outputs that came from data governance, policies and documents and those types of things. Well, we shouldn't be really looking at measurable business outputs. We should be looking at measurable business outcomes. What impact have we had on the business? And if we can relate that to the things that stewards are doing within the organization to show those positive measurements of business outcomes, I think that's something that we need to be doing. We need to be aligning the stewardships with things that are coming down the pike, but we also need to measure them to specific business outcomes instead of specific business outputs. Championing a culture of shared accountability. Again, I think the idea of if people know that they're not just the one steward of the organization for customer, and there's other people that are also stewarding customer data, it kind of builds a community of interest, a community of practice, or maybe even a center of excellence around that specific domain of data. So champion a culture in your organization where there's shared accountability and you're not giving all of that accountability to specifically one data steward. All right, I know we're running out of time here. We'll take questions here in a few minutes. I just want to go through some examples of organizations that I have worked with that have really um, taken a kind of a forward thinking or a unique approach to stewardship within their organizations. And the interesting thing about this list is there's no financial institutions. I just noticed that before the webinar. I mean, one of them is an insurance company, one of them is a federal government agency. We know how that's going right now here in the US at least. Multinational manufacturing company, a retailer, and also a healthcare company. So let's kind of go through them quickly, then I'll turn it back over to Gallo and see if we have any questions today. So this global insurance leader, actually, when I first put this together, I actually thought of a better example than this in terms of a case study. I had a big insurance company here in the U.S. that determined that they were spending $14 million a year on returned mail, and that $14 million, the returned mail, is because of poor quality, poor timeliness of the data for the mailings that were going out. And the one thing I suggested to them is don't go to your leadership and say we're spending $14 million on return mail, because they'll laugh at you. They'll ask you for more details. Start by saying, we're spending 3 million, 4 million, 5 million. And when they ask questions about that, pull out your paperwork that shows where all the costs are going, and be able to demonstrate to them that, yeah, we are spending more than $5 million on return mail, or we're reducing policy errors, as this global insurance company did, by embedding stewardship into what people do within the organization. A federal government agency that I'm doing work with right now, they wrote non-invasive data governance into their data strategy. So they're looking for ways to be able to take to implement stewardship, to recognize people who are already stewarding the data and get them to improve the way that they're interacting with the data. And so they were able to demonstrate value, to clean up things that were fragmented reporting, fragmented compliance reporting, improve the quality of the metadata, basically just by recognizing people at different levels of the organization as being either operational stewards, and there's lots of them, or the subject matter expert stewards, or the tactical level stewards, of which there are less of them. So that is how they went about implementing stewardship in their organization. A very large manufacturing company who I will not name, but if you think of it in terms of where they've been having engineering problems and supply chain problems, they really started by focusing on the domain level stewards, the people that were the subject matters for this data globally across the organization, and started governing specifically to the domains. A Fortune 100 retailer, instead of having data product stewards, they had product data stewards for the different products that they sold. And they started to empower those specific individuals who knew the most about that product. And they engaged the stewards that way. They started at the tactical level rather than starting at the operational level. And then the last one I want to share with you is a healthcare organization. And I know I'm going through these quickly, but you can go back and read these, what they did when they focused in an organization like this, focused on clinical data. And they embedded stewards into the teams instead of assigning people to be new stewards, or telling people now that they're data stewards and expecting them to go do data steward stuff. So I apologize for kind of speeding up there at the end, but you can always go back to the slides. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me. We talked about emerging trends. We talked about tools. We talked about best practices and how to align stewardship for things that are going to be changing, for future governance needs. And then I quickly went through the case studies at the end. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Gallo, to see if we have any questions from today. And just one last comment is, if people want to connect to me on LinkedIn, that's how you can do it. It's on the screen. I tend to write articles once a week or so that talk about governance and stewardship and changing the narrative, like I spoke about earlier. I look forward to connecting to you on LinkedIn. And with that, Gallo, it's back to you.
All right. Yeah, we do have quite a few questions. Let's see how many we can get through. We have wrote down every one of them. So you with us? hang with us real quick.
Okay.
What does it mean to formalize accountability in terms of data stewardship training?
In firm forms, well, formalizing accountability. So everybody, I would say that your leadership would say that everybody in the organization that uses data that is sensitive is responsible for protecting that sensitive data. So I'd say that what stewardship means, what formalizing accountability means, is taking it out from being something that's hidden, that's maybe been expressed to them once, and it's something that's reiterated to them time and time again. That because of their relationship to the data, they're gonna and because of compliance or regulatory needs or quality needs within the organization, we need to formalize all these things that have been informal in the past. So it comes with education of the stewards, it comes with training of the stewards, it comes with providing tools to the stewards. That's a great question. You've already got stewards in your organization. The problem is they're mostly informal, most likely. And because they're informal, they're also inefficient and ineffective in the stewarding activities that they're addressing.
So bounce off question off the one we just had. Who should uh be a data steward then?
Who should be a data steward? Well, like I said, everybody in the organization, if they are being held accountable for their relationship to the data, and pretty much everybody in the organization either defines and or produces and or uses data as part of their job. When you ask who the steward should be, if those people that define, produce, and use data as part of their job are being held formally accountable for how they define, produce, and use data, then the answer to the question of who the steward should be is everybody is a data steward. And that we need to get over that fact, and we need to understand that may add complexities to our data governance program. But if we are going to cover from soup to nuts, from beginning to end, the governance of data in the organization, we need to start thinking about stewardship differently. We need to start thinking about potentially everybody or more than just a few select people are stewards of the data. So that's who the stewards should be, everybody in the organization.
All right, another one. What are the key KPIs that are a must for data stewardship?
Well, I ran through a few of the KPIs, and many organizations that I'm familiar with um, focus on critical data elements. So if you're familiar with the concept of CDEs, and we've done that in the past, I think that's where stewards really should be focusing on. Again, don't define all 150 columns within a database. Identify and focus on those specific things that are going to add business value to the organization, those things that there are questions about, those things that are inconsistent across the organization. So, I mean, the way, when we talk about formalizing their accountability, it's not really adding to what they're doing. It's just helping them to do what they already do better.
One more. Who standardizes responsibility among coordinate data stewards and coordinates at organizational level, promotes data and metadata maintenance? It
Well, I would say
continues.
oftentimes I suggest that there is a person within a business function that is a coordinator of the activities of the stewards. They may not be the steward themselves, they may be a steward themselves, basically because they're like everybody else. They probably define, produce, or use data as part of their job. But somebody who is basically if you leave the stewards to their own accord, they're going to do things their way. If you kind of coordinate and kind of guide them down the proper behavior for data, they're not going to do that consistently across the organization on their own. That's why there is need for a data governance administration function, a data stewardship administration function. Again, stewards need help. You can't just tag them as a steward and expect them to behave the way that you want them to behave. It needs to be administered by somebody in the organization.
In the world of real time data, what are your thoughts about the building of the data products and what the role stewards should be playing in the management of these products?
Well, I'm not a data product expert, nor am I a real-time data expert. Um, I just say that it shifts the way stewards need to behave. I mean, if the data, it's not a database that's updated every week or every month or every year. It's real-time data coming through the organization. So we need to change the behaviors of the stewards to act accordingly with data that is now coming into the organization in different ways. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but I think that the kind of is the bottom line for the webinar today is start to recognize the stewards for what they're already doing, start to engage them per what they're already doing, build it in and embed it in the things that they're already doing, and you're going to find that that's going to be a positive future for your stewardship program in your organization.
Alrighty, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for. We do have a few others. We'll see about if we can get these other ones answered in our follow-up emails or anything. But thank you, Bob, for this great presentation and Q&A. But yeah, I'm afraid that is all the time we have for today. I just want to remind everyone we will be posting the recorded webinar and slides to dataversity.net within 2 business days. And we will be sending out a follow-up email to let you know for the links for that and other requested information. Thank you all for attending today's webinar, and we hope you have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you, Gallo. Appreciate your help today.
Hey, you're welcome. It
All right.
was fun producing for you guys.
Take care, everybody.